Welcome to the Sacred Everywhere. I'm Dr. Sheri Kling, and in this space we explore how the sacred shows up in real life, in our questions, our struggles, our longing, and our hope. Can we find the sacred in every place and everyone? Let's see. As I'm recording this, I'm sitting on a balcony at the Cayuga Conference Center in Henderson, North Carolina, where I've been teaching at an intensive for the Hayden Institute's DreamWork certification program. Yesterday morning, I spoke on dreams, healing, and religious experience. And you can hear the birds around me as I'm sitting on this balcony. It's still the edge of winter here, not quite fully spring, although there are flowers blooming, some daffodils, and there are some blooms on some of the trees. But it was 31 degrees yesterday morning, and I think it's going to be in the 20s here next week when I will be back in Florida. But here in my talk yesterday, I began with an exploration of the deep fragmentation that we're experiencing in Western culture and in the United States specifically. We see fragmentation at all levels, everywhere around us. At the societal level, we see it in our political polarization, in racism, in our inability to talk at all anymore across difference. We see it at the interpersonal level, where we see chronic loneliness and a widespread meaning crisis and exponentially growing levels of mental health issues. And we also see it at the intrapersonal level, meaning we're fragmented and split from our own selves. And we see as evidence of that, we see the horrible effects of early life adverse experience and trauma on adult health outcomes and risky behaviors. This was shown in a study called the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experience study that was done in California with Kaiser Permanente and the CDC in the late 1990s. And another telling statistic of our fragmentation comes from a general social survey from about 10 years ago, where the data showed that 1/3 of Americans had no one with whom they could share their personal struggles and triumphs. And when family members were excluded, half said they had no one. Now, in my talk here, I placed much of the blame for our fragmentation on the worldview that dominates Western culture, which is dualistic, mechanistic, materialistic, and dismissive of anything not considered rational, quote unquote. In this worldview, mind is separate from body, facts are separate from values, and all the things that mean the most to us, love, beauty, justice, dreams, synchronicities, experiences of the sacred, are all dismissed as subjective and therefore as objectively unreal. But if we're paying attention, even from the contemporary sciences, we're getting another story. We're learning of a world of interconnected ecosystems in which nothing can be isolated from everything else or anything else. And we're learning of quantum fields of possibilities, matrices in which all things are held as one whole, again, where nothing can be separated from other things. And even in theology, we can find beautiful ways of looking at God and the world that stress relatedness, meaning, and value, and creative transformation, where each one of us matters, has value, where each one of us belongs because we're part of the whole, and where each one of us is capable of transformation or positive change. But these theological and scientific ideas never seem to trickle down to our hearts. Our hearts are still broken. Even the most beautiful ideas just don't have the power to radically transform our experience of life. They don't give us what Joseph Campbell said we're really looking for, which is an experience of the rapture of being alive. What does have the power to facilitate that kind of radical change are embodied experiences of wholeness. Ideas don't do it, but when we can have an experience in our bodies of wholeness, of our connectedness to something greater than ourselves that holds us, that's what has the power to radically change us. We see that in religious experience, in mystical experience, in ecstatic experience. We're seeing it in recent times in people who report near-death experiences. We're seeing it in people who've had, often in people who have had psychedelic experiences. And so when I spoke yesterday morning about the healing power of these kinds of experiences, I offered spiritual dream work as one practice that can help us have those kinds of embodied experiences of wholeness. You don't have to have a near-death experience, and you don't necessarily have to take a substance that's hallucinogenic. You can just turn to your own dreams that come to you every night. Now, my own bit of qualitative research in a small pilot study that I did in 2014 showed that dream workers' sense of wholeness and their relationships with God and others were all enhanced by dream work, by specifically a Jungian style approach to dream work. It's been astoundingly true for me and for the others who are gathered here at Cayuga this weekend for this dream intensive. Now, at breakfast this morning, the people at my table were talking about how difficult it is to make new friends as adults. That's one of the reasons why we're so lonely in general. And one of us at the table had retired from active ministry, and he and his wife both missed the community that church had provided them. I miss my days in graduate school not that long ago, where I was surrounded by others on similar paths who I could easily encounter in class and in student housing and have great conversations with. Another place that I actually made great friends was at the dog park. When I lived in California, when I lived even in Chicago, and there was a park across the street from where I lived where I would take my dog and play with the other dogs. In California, it was interesting because I went to a park in a nearby town just about every afternoon. First with my dog, Cotton, and then when I got a second dog named Bobby, I would take them both just about every day. And there were people who gathered there every day, the dog park pack, we called ourselves. And, these weren't necessarily people I would have socialized with. We weren't the same politically. We weren't the same spiritually. But we loved our dogs. And we had a good time. We would even get together for birthdays at restaurants, of course without our dogs, to celebrate each other's birthdays. And we had connection there. But these days, I often experience loneliness. I live now in Florida. I do serve a church, so I do have a church community. And my parents live there, so I do have them. And I have begun to make other friends, mostly through music. I play music, and so I've found some folks in the music community that I connect with. But I still experience loneliness, and I don't have a lot of friends, aside from my next-door neighbor and folks like that. But these Hayden gatherings that I attend are like oases of community for me. Whenever I come, back to this place. And, we're not all from here. Some are from the local area here around Asheville, but most of us come from other places. And they're like these oases where we can gather up and be together. And Corey Keyes, who's the director of the Hayden Institute, mentioned at breakfast that he sees these gatherings like the ephemeral pools that Leanne Hennion writes about in her book, Night Magic, Adventures Among Glowworms, Moon Gardens, and Other Marvels of the Dark. I've not yet read the book, but now I really want to. But I did find an excerpt from the book, and in that book, she describes an ephemeral pool of water in the midst of a strip mall where certain kinds of salamanders are able to find the darkness and the water that they need to lay their eggs. The pool forms, because of the rain. It's not a permanent pool. It's an ephemeral pool. It comes and it goes. The pool forms, and these beautiful beings come together in dances of nourishing connection and generativity. Now, while those of us at the table this morning laughed that most of us aren't mating here at these Hayden gatherings, we do come here to honor the dreams that arise in the darkness from the waters of the unconscious, nourishing our souls and generating a beautiful kind of community that we don't often find elsewhere. But here's the rub. It's easy to connect with people who think like us. When we stay in our bubbles, nothing challenges us. Very little rubs against us in a way that we find irritating. We get really irritated out there in the real world where we're encountering people all the time that are not like us, that are other than us, that think in ways we don't understand. But think of the oyster and the pearl. The way that bit of beauty, that beautiful, beautiful beauty of the pearl is created is when an oyster is irritated by grains of sand rubbing up against its interior. And it's out of that irritation, out of that challenge to its inner peace, that it's forced to create the luminescent material that will become the pearl. We don't live in a frictionless world. There is no real world that is frictionless. In his book, Healing the Heart of Democracy, that I'm reading right now, Parker Palmer writes that if you don't like tension, you don't want to live in a democracy. In fact, he argues that democracy requires the ability to hold tension creatively and in life-giving ways. Right now, so many of us see ourselves as surrounded by enemies. But what if we're really just surrounded by people in fragmented pain who, like wolves caught in leg-hold traps, can't help but lash out at anyone they meet? What if we're all so traumatized by the world we live in, by the families we grew up in, who were just doing the best they could, but who were wounded people? And we know that wounded people wound. What if we're just surrounded by people in pain, or by people with contrasting perspectives that we need in order to live as whole people? What if the people we see today as enemies might really be able to help us learn new ways to see the world that may contribute to the overall beauty of this mosaic that we call life? Just wanted to leave you with that thought today. Thanks for being part of this journey. If these conversations matter to you, Your membership helps make them possible. Until next time, may you notice the sacred.